All right, so I want to do my presentation today. I entitled it "The Biology and Natural History of the Lewis and Clark Expedition." And a couple of years ago, I decided I wanted to read about early American history. I thought, I had always heard about Lewis and Clark, never studied anything, didn't. I started out with almost zero knowledge of it. And as I started reading and reading their journals, it has become an addiction. And that so I'm actually trying to follow the Lewis and Clark Trail, and so I'll be showing you that there's actually a national park map for the Lewis and Clark Trail, and actually this is a picture I took in Steubenville, Ohio. That's one of the stops on the Lewis and Clark Trail there. I took that last fall, but let me jump in here, and I promised today that I'm barely scratching the surface because this was a 2.5 year expedition. So in 45 minutes, I'm just barely scratching it. Um, so a lot of people may not know that the official name was called the Corps of Discovery, and it went from 1803 to 1806. And I'm going to come back to this picture and talk about these are the three main vessels that they used. They had one large boat called a keel boat, and then they had two smaller boats called pirogues here, but I'll come back to those in a second. And so I want to give you a little bit of background history. So the president at this time who orders the expedition is Thomas Jefferson. He was president from 1801 to 1809, and all the way back to when he was governor of Virginia. He wanted to explore this territory, but the United States didn't own it at that time. So now with the Louisiana Purchase, we actually own it, and he can send an expedition up through here. Okay, so real quick on the Louisiana Purchase. Most people have heard of the Louisiana Purchase. I'm going to get a little laser pointer for the screen right here. So now right here it says France, but there's some complicated politics here. So at the end of the Revolutionary War, our treaty with Great Britain is that we got everything east of the Mississippi River. So this is, and Florida is still under the control of Spain. So this is what the United States looks like in 1803 here. Okay. And then what happened was when the French lost the French and Indian War, they gave the Louisiana Territory to their ally Spain because they didn't want Great Britain to get their hands on it. Well, then around 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte becomes the ruler of France, and he convinces Spain to give it back to France. And now another thing that's going on here, when Spain is in control of this, they shut down the Mississippi River in New Orleans, and they would not let us ship our goods out. And this really hurt a lot of people. It really hurt the state of Kentucky because they relied on floating their goods down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, and out through New Orleans. So we couldn't ship our goods out. Okay, Mike?
I'm sorry. If I understand it, I think the Mississippi actually flow. I think you're literally going downstream and going from Kentucky to Louisiana.
Right, that's downstream
So
because
you just have the stream to power you going down.
yeah, there's no engines. The steam engine has been invented, but it's not perfected yet, so it's not really in use at this time. So they had to just float down the currents. They used what were called flatboats back then. Now, but we couldn't get our goods out of Kentucky. So Thomas Jefferson asked his envoys in France to ask Napoleon if he'd be willing to sell New Orleans. He says, start at about 2 million. I'm willing to pay $10 million for it. Well, Napoleon's war is not going so well for him. And so he needs money. He says, well, instead of buying New Orleans for 10 million, how about you get this whole thing for 15 million? And Thomas Jefferson jumps all over that deal. It calculates to less than 4 cents an acre. It's considered the greatest land deal in the history of the world here. And with the stroke of a pen, we basically doubled the size of the United States here. So now he's ready to send this expedition up to see, what did I just buy? What kind of resources are in the Louisiana Purchase here? He says, okay, I know the perfect person to lead the expedition. My personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. He's an outdoorsman. He's a great hunter. He was known as a great shot with a back then it was flintlock muzzleloaders. They said anything larger than a mouse, he would hit it at 100 yards. So he was a pretty good shot. Outdoorsman, had military experience. And so Meriwether Lewis like, yeah, I'll do it. He's excited about it. He says, but we need a second leader. You know, if I get injured or killed, we need someone else that can keep the expedition going. And he said, I know the perfect person. And it was his former commander in the military, William Clark. So he invites William Clark to join. And so they become essentially co-captains of the expedition. So that's how they were chosen. I wanted to show some of the sciences. It was primarily a scientific exploration, but it was led by military. Almost every man, they had a crew of about 45 people that leave St. Louis, and they were almost all military men, but it was a scientific exploration here. So some of the sciences, they did astronomy. They were especially taking latitude and longitude readings here at various points. Biology, they are credited with discovering almost 300 species of plants and animals. And you're going to see that some of the animals that are just common knowledge to us, they're actually given credit for discovering for science here. Chemistry, there's stories where Lewis is testing different ores to see what the quality of the ore is. So he's doing chemistry experiments. Geography, cartography, William Clark makes a map of the Louisiana Purchase. So that was a big deal there because that's what President Jefferson wanted. Geology, so they're making note of things like coal deposits and flint and stuff like that that had monetary value. Hydrology, they had thermometers and they took water temperatures, they measured depth and the width of rivers, they measured the speed of the currents here. One thing that amazed me, because I'm a microbiologist, was the microbiology and pharmacology. In microbiology class, we often say that, you know, really pharmacology starts around 1900 with a man named Paul Ehrlich. But here, 100 years earlier, Lewis is doctoring people, and he's using things like mercury and sulfur and stuff to treat diseases on this trip. So I was really amazed at his knowledge here. Then linguistics, they were studying, they wrote down vocabulary words of the different tribes. They encountered, they estimate about 50 different Indian tribes. And so they were trying to see which ones are related to each other and so forth there. And then I put social and political science because what they're doing is they want to create a friendly relationship with the Indians for trade. And then, and they want to, and they're encourage the tribes to be peaceful with each other. And then they're also notifying them, hey, you're no longer under French rule. The United States now owns this territory. So they're giving information as well. Okay, now some textbooks, when you look up the Lewis Clark, yeah, Mike?
I'm just going to shut up after this. What little I know, and it's pretty doggone little, is all they need to use is the altitude of Polaris to determine their latitude.
Yeah, and I also discovered that they could do it at noon with the sun.
Sure,
yeah, so they also
that's east-west.
They did a lot of their latitude readings at noon here. So
the longitude of that.
Yeah.
Latitude be at night.
Yeah. So okay. Now like I said, some textbooks they'll say the Lewis Clark expedition went from St. Louis to the West Coast and back, and that is true. That's the main expedition, but there's a lot more to it than that. I like this map. You see the red is from St. Louis out and back. Over here in yellow, it says is the preparation for the expedition. The orange, which is primarily the Ohio River here, is the recruitment. So what happens is the biggest boat that they have, it was built in Pittsburgh, and so he has to float it down the Ohio River there. So it really kind of starts in Pittsburgh. But and along the way, they're recruiting and gathering. And again, they would eventually have about 45 men on the expedition here. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit. I'm going to switch to this map. This is actually the National Park Lewis and Clark Trail map. And over here, so since Jefferson is president, he's going to be in Washington, D.C., and his personal home is in Monticello. So Lewis is going to be back and forth there. Jefferson was a naturalist and he's a pretty good botanist. So he trains Lewis in how to take plant specimens and how to preserve them and bring them back with him. And then he ships Lewis off to Philadelphia, where there's the American Philosophical Society. It was started by Benjamin Franklin. And he gets further trained in how to do Linnaean classification with plants and animals. Also, he meets Benjamin Rush, who was the most famous doctor in the United States at this time. He was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he trains him in medicine and gives him a bunch of medicine. One kind of comical thing is Rush had developed a famous pill. It was a laxative. Back then, the most common thing a doctor, when you were sick, the most common thing they would do is they would bleed you and they would give you a laxative. And his laxative was so strong, they called it Rush's Thunderbolts. And I'll let you use your imagination on that one. But it was very effective, and they used a lot of that. Then he goes to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and there's a gentleman there that actually trains him on how to make the latitude and longitude readings there. And then Harper's Ferry, which is in West Virginia now. This was the armory, and so he needs, they do have to be prepared in case they do get attacked by Indian tribes. So they go and they're well armed, and he gets all his weapons and supplies from Harper's Ferry. They get shipped by wagon to Pittsburgh, and then he loads his boat, and he leaves in September of 1803 to start coming down the Ohio River here. And I wish I had time to talk about some of their stops here, but I'm going to come down right here. And so now we're in Kentucky. There's a state park called Big Bone Lick State Park. And what it's famous for is they discovered fossils of mammoths and mastodons. And so one of the myths was that there might still be living mammoths in the West. And Jefferson's telling Lewis, he's like, I want you to see, are there still living mammoths out there? And Lewis actually stops here and he digs up some fossils and has them shipped back to Washington, D.C. before he continues on down here. And he stops at Louisville. Across the river from Louisville is Clarksville. This is where William Clark's family lives. And this is where he picks up William Clark. So Lewis is by himself with some helpers from Pittsburgh to Louisville, but then he picks up William Clark there. There's what's called the Falls of the Ohio there, which my understanding is you could navigate it, but it was tricky. So he hires a local guide to help get the big boat past the Falls of the Ohio there. Okay. And we're going to continue. Now, what I have here is
Louisville is the Falls City.
Yeah.
You had to do portage.
Yeah. Today there's a canal there that goes around it, but
What did you say, Rob? I have an apology.
That's why Louisville is called the Falls City.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So this is the keel boat, and this is Clark's drawing in the journals. This top view shows that it could be rowed, and then you see these walkways right here. So another way they could, because they're going to be going upstream on the Missouri River, and so that you could take a pole and put it if the water's shallow enough, stick it in the bottom, and then walk that walkway and push the boat upstream there. And then down here it shows that those walkways could fold up if they get attacked, and they can hide behind them and shoot and defend themselves there. And then in the back there's this canopy here. So when I go to this picture again, the captains could sit back here. They could talk about, they even had like a desk where they journaled and stuff, so they could do their administrative work here while the men are working. Now here it shows they're rowing. The boat also had a 30-foot mast, so if the wind was favorable, they could use wind power. You see the poles back here that they could push with poles. And then here we have men pushing floating logs and stuff out of the way. And then the two what are called pirogues, these are like giant canoes. They also have a mast, but they would they could hold anywhere from like 8 to 12 men there. So they have this keel boat, and you also see this swivel gun cannon on the front that they had for defense. So they were pretty well set up for defense. Thankfully, they didn't really have to use it. Now, just last week, I went to a museum on the Illinois side of St. Louis, there you can go to. They have this life-size 55-foot version of the keel boat to give you an idea what it looks like here. On the other side, it's cut longitudinally, so you can get an idea of how they pack this thing. So you have to keep the walkways open, but underneath they could pack their goods, everything. You see the swivel gun and the mast up here, and then shows here things like tarping for camping, powder horns, all their food and kegs of food and supplies and so forth. Over here, these are lead canisters of gunpowder, which were watertight. So if it fell in the water, they kept their powder dry. There were places where they had to use dugout canoes. So that gives an example of a dugout canoe made out of a tree log that they could use. Of course, you can't forget the whiskey. They took a lot of whiskey with them. And then it shows here things like onions and salt pork. Now, they only used the salt pork if they didn't have fresh meat. So some of the guys, about 4 of the guys were hired as hunters. And so they ate a lot of deer, elk, beaver, just about anything they could get there. And they reserved their salt pork for when they couldn't get fresh game. Now, in 1803, what is considered the top of the line, most advanced weapon in the world is basically the Kentucky long rifle or the Pennsylvania long rifle. Now, Lewis has some slight modifications made at the Armory in Harper's Ferry, and they produced this gun. It's called the Harper's Ferry 1803 rifle, and this is considered it's a flintlock muzzle-loading rifle, and that was the top of the line weapon at the time that they carried with them. He also, in Pittsburgh, he paid $20 for a Newfoundland dog named Seaman, and Seaman makes the entire trip there. And in the journals, there are some pretty interesting stories about Seaman. Eventually, the men loved this dog, and they took care of him. And he even helped. It's amazing. Like if he saw an antelope swimming in a river, he would jump out, grab the antelope, drown it, and then drag it up to the shore so that they could eat it. So he actually helped gather food for them. And that's a pretty amazing dog.
He's first class hunting dog.
Yeah, he was. Okay. So here we are at Louisville. Next, I'm going to mention coming down here to Fort Massac, which is right across the Ohio River from Paducah. And now they stop at a couple of forts, and this is where they're picking up men. They got like 9 men in Louisville. They got like another 9 men at Fort Massac here. And then another one is Fort Kaskasky up here before you get to St. Louis here. So this is where they're gathering their men. And now this is another one. So one of their sergeants was a man named Patrick Gass. He's buried in West Virginia. So I went to his grave. He is the last person of the expedition to die. He lived to be 98 years old. And on his tombstone, it says here, Lewis and Clark expedition. And then after that, he fought in the War of 1812. So he's a pretty amazing man there. So I was honored to see his grave in West Virginia.
Where'd you see that? I'm sorry.
That's in West Virginia. Yeah. In Maysville, Kentucky, they picked up a guy named John Coulter, who would actually go on to become a famous mountain man himself. And this sign says he is credited as being the first white man to report seeing the thermal wonders of present Yellowstone National Park. And the story is when he came back to camp and told people about the geysers and the smoke spewing up under the ground, they didn't believe him. They thought he was making it all up. So that's a funny story there as well. This is Fort Massac. I took this picture over there. They picked up a guy here named George Drouillard, who was very valuable. He was half French, half Indian. He could interpret. He knew the Indian Sign Language, which you've all seen that in movies, right? I did not realize that sign language was universal. Every Indian nation they came to, whether it was in Missouri or in Oregon and Washington, they all spoke this universal sign language. And that was just truly amazing to me.
I thought it was just Hollywood. Huh?
No, it was actually true. So he was a big interpreter for them, and he was one of their best hunters. And at the end, when you read the journals, it's like, man, how many buffalo and elk did this guy kill? But Lewis even says that if it wasn't for George Drouillard, we may have starved to death. He was such a good hunter there. Now, this is the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi at Cairo, Illinois. And one reason why this is important, they stayed 6 days here because there's what's called the third principal meridian runs through here. So this is a longitudinal line that has a known value. And so what do scientists do before they do their experiments? They calibrate their instruments, right? So they spent 6 days making sure they could calculate and get the right longitudinal reading here before they start up the Mississippi River. So then they come up the Mississippi. Again, they stop at Fort Kaskaskia, get some men, and they come up and they camp on the Illinois side, and they make a winter camp. So this is the winter of 1803, 1804 at what's called Camp Dubois, that's right across from St. Louis here. So that's the 1803, 1804 camp. They have a replica of that camp there if you go visit. So what happened here, when they get there, the Louisiana Purchase, again, this is back before internet, so this takes months. And the Spanish ambassador there, he's like, you guys aren't going anywhere. This is Spanish territory, and you are not going up this river. And well, in March of 1804, they finally had a ceremony in St. Louis where the Spanish signed it over to the French, and then the French immediately signed it over to the United States. And he said, you guys are free to go now. It's your property here. And so here's from Camp Dubois. They take their boat. They go out. This is the Mississippi River cross, and then right here is the mouth of the Missouri. So this is the starting point from the St. Louis area, going up into the mouth of the Missouri River, and it's all upstream here. And it just amazes me the amount of physical labor. If you could imagine taking a boat that's 55 feet long, they estimated where it weighed 10 to 12 tons, and you're pushing upstream for 1,600 miles.
Did they use horsepower for some of it, Roger, you think?
No, they never used a horse, but they did tow. Sometimes they had to get in the water with tow lines and pull it. It was all manpower. There was no horse pulling at all. Now, the Lewis and Clark journals are online. They're very fascinating read. I have them on my phone, and down here the address is lewisandclarkjournals.unl.edu. UNL stands for University of Nebraska Lincoln. That's actually where the most famous repository of Lewis and Clark information is. Now, when you look at the journals, what's nice about this is it has all the journals. So if Lewis makes an entry, he'll be first, and then Clark, and then you can see the other guys. There was a sergeant named Ordway. There's a Sergeant Floyd. Now, what's amazing is of these 45 men, only one man actually dies on the expedition, and he's not killed by Indians. He's not killed by a bear. He actually dies from what they believe was appendicitis. And then after he dies, he's replaced by Patrick Gass, who is the one I showed you the grave of earlier. Now, a lot of people like to read the journals in their original because this is before spellers and before dictionaries were popular. So there's a lot of gross misspellings. My understanding is that actually happened about 1828. But people like to see, they just spelled stuff how it sounded to them. I have here where Floyd said, set out early, ERRLEY. We proceed, PROSSED. So again, big misspellings. Now, Patrick Gass, when he published his journals, he took them to an editor and had them cleaned up. So his reads normal, but the others, there's some interesting spellings there. Then there's a man named Whitehouse. And then at the bottom, there's lots of footnotes that'll say, when they describe this animal, this is the animal we think they're describing. Or when they describe this rock formation, we think this is what they're talking about. So lots of really cool information that's there in the journal. So I wanted to point that out. Okay, come back. So down here at the bottom, this is from St. Louis across Missouri to Kansas City. So that's like a 4-hour drive in a car, right? It takes them 6 weeks. And again, very hard work. And when they get north of Kansas City, they they have the 4th of July of 1804. And so it says they celebrated, they drank some whiskey, and they fired the cannon. So you imagine they're out in the middle of nowhere celebrating the 4th of July here. But yeah, Mike?
I apologize. So it was pretty much a constant labor. They probably had to alternate shifts of people.
Yeah,
going on that boat.
they alternated shifts. They would stop and rest at lunchtime and then do another shift in the afternoon and so forth there. Now here they start seeing animals that were unknown to science, unknown to most white people here. Now, north of Kansas City, Clark starts saying he was seeing a lot of parakeets. And I'm like, I didn't even know we had parakeets in the United States. But this is an extinct bird that was called the North Carolina parakeet, and they were seeing them. And this is a drawing from John James Audubon. And I looked at it, I was like, is it not such a shame that such a beautiful bird is extinct? But they saw that, and they saw one of the most famous extinct birds, and that's the passenger pigeon. In the journals, there's where Lewis shoots some of these and eats them there. So, and that's another Audubon painting. So these are some of the animals they start seeing. Here I made a note of astronomical observations. He's talking about the moon with Aquila and Aldebaran, and then he writes down what the latitude was at this particular location there. So lots of astronomical observations. When they would come to a place that did not already have a name, now.
Must have been springtime.
Yeah, this is spring.
Aldebaran, you can see in the midwinter to spring.
Yeah.
And Aquarius would be wintertime. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So this is this is late spring, early summer here. And now another thing they would do is they would name places after stuff that they encountered. So a guy named Goodrich catches a catfish that they had never seen before. They said it was almost white. He says it's a white catfish that has a tail like a dolphin. This was the channel catfish, and they are given credit for discovering the channel catfish. And I made a note here, most of our game fish, they have these blunt tails. But if you look down here, the channel catfish has a very deep forked tail. So that's what he was talking about. That was a diagnostic feature of that. But they're given credit for discovering the channel catfish. I don't have a picture, but they're also given credit for discovering the famous cutthroat trout. And I found out the species name for the cutthroat trout is Clarkii. So it's named after William Clark. Here they're measuring speed of water and temperatures here. Eventually they reached a point where all their thermometers broke and they couldn't take any more temperature readings. Also their chronometers broke and they couldn't get longitude readings, and they only did latitude from that point there. Okay, I mentioned that a lot of the animals they're seeing for the first time are stuff that's pretty common to us. So right over here, he says, the first wild ones I ever saw. But elk, and of course, elk would become one of their main food staples. There's a set of elk horns that Lewis sent back to Thomas Jefferson, and he hung them at Monticello. So if you go visit Monticello, they're hanging in the foyer there. Yep. Of course, the buffalo, that was a major food source for them. They discovered the coyote. They're like, what is this thing? It's like, it's smaller than a wolf, but it's bigger than a fox. And they actually called it the prairie wolf to distinguish it from the gray wolf. But they discovered the coyote. Bighorn sheep they had never heard of or seen before. And actually they saw skins and horns from the Indians before they saw their first live specimen there. Jackrabbits, they could not believe how big these rabbits were. And they actually recorded how far one jumped, and one of them jumped 22 feet, if you can imagine that. So pretty amazing. They were familiar with bald eagles, but they had never seen a golden eagle before. And the Indian chiefs had a lot of golden eagle feathers in their headdresses there. Pronghorn antelope. When they saw this thing, they're like, we don't even know what to call this thing. We've never seen anything like it. Clark called them goats. And technically, antelope is an incorrect term. Pronghorn is the correct term for them there. They'd never seen prairie dogs. Lewis called them barking squirrels. And now they took a lot of specimens and preserved them, sent them back. they attempted to send back some live specimens. There are only 2 live animals that made it all the way back to Washington, D.C. One was a prairie dog, and the other was a magpie, which, if you're not familiar with magpies, they're kind of like a small crow. They're a scavenger, but you can see they're black and white with a little bit of blue. They're very common out west there, but one of the magpies made it as well. Yeah, it's a beautiful bird.
They ate them.
Oh, did they?
I was in, I can't remember, I think it was Montana, and I saw them, and I was Wyoming, and I asked somebody about it. He said, that's a magpie, we shoot them.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're like crows. They're considered a nuisance. They're a scavenger bird. They saw grouse that they called pheasants, and this is a sharp-tailed grouse that they discovered. And this one on the right is called a long-billed curlew, a shorebird that they found. And I'm still researching to find out why they called it the long-billed curlew, but when I figure that out, I'll tell you. There's 2 birds that are named after them. The one on the left is called the Lewis woodpecker. I've never seen one of these myself. And the one on the right is called Clark's nutcracker. And when I lived in Arizona, we had lots of those. Beautiful bird. It was one of my favorite birds when I lived there. And I could tell from personal experience that they love potato chips there. So. Now, again, they made drawings in their journals. This is a fish that William Clark drew. So they were pretty good artists as well. And they did catch a lot of fish. On the east side of the Rocky Mountains, they were catching a lot of trout. And then on the west side, they started catching salmon. This is a botanical specimen that Lewis drew. And then this was a bush that they had never seen before. It's called buffalo berry, but it became one of their main food sources. And Lewis talks about how they would take it and mix it with some of their flour and make a tart out of it. And I could imagine that was a nice treat after a long, hard day of pushing a boat upstream there. But apparently a very sweet tasting berry.
Like a Pop-Tart.
Yeah. Now, one of the most comical things in the journals is Lewis's evolution of his opinion of the grizzly bear. They had never seen grizzly bears. And of course, he's familiar with the black bear, which is very docile in comparison. So he starts comparing. Now, his first mention was, he's like, the Indians talk about this bear. They say it's so ferocious and they're so scared of it. The first ones they saw, when the bears heard them coming, they saw the bears running off. And he's like, well, they're a lot more skittish than the Indians make them sound. So he wasn't too concerned. Then they finally kill one. And he writes that, well, I can see why the Indians are concerned with bows and arrows, but we have our guns. We're not afraid of these things. Well, a couple months later, after some really close calls, one man actually had bear claw marks on his moccasins. He came so close to getting killed. He starts changing his attitude. And after Lewis himself is almost killed by a grizzly bear, he had just shot at a deer and he hadn't loaded his gun yet. And a bear charges him. He runs into the river and he turns around. Lewis carried this what a lot of people call it a pike. He calls it an S pontoon, which I had never heard that word before there. But he turned around and he faced off this bear with the S pontoon, and the bear backed down and did not kill him.
I think those things, Roger, you can correct me because you know more than I do, but I would think those grizzlies can run not a little faster, a whole lot faster than a human being.
Oh, yeah. They're much faster than that. So you don't have much chance. But the fact that he went into the river and had this S pontoon with them, the bear decided it wasn't worth the fight. And so he was spared. And then you see him write in a journal. He's like, this one bear charged us. We shot it 8 times through the heart and lungs. It still chased us a half mile. And after it fell over, it took 20 more minutes to die. He's like, these are the most ferocious, horrible things. And so his attitude of grizzly bears definitely evolved.
Several shots to kill him?
Yeah, 8 times through the heart and lungs.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
They must have pretty impervious skin or something.
Yes, definitely. Okay, I'm going to, so here we are in Kansas City. We're going to come up. Now, I mentioned that Floyd is the only person that died. He actually dies up here in what is today Sioux City, Iowa, and his grave is marked here. And then they go on up and they start encountering their first Indians. They encounter what's called the Yankton Sioux. They also had meetings with Ottawa Indians. when they meet what's called the Lakota Sioux, that meeting did not go so well. That band of Sioux, they basically tried to shut down the river, and they were trying to steal from traders. Well, when the Sioux saw how well armed the Lewis and Clark expedition were, we better let these guys go. I don't think we're going to win this fight. And that, so they get past the Sioux, and they come up here. There's a place called Fort Mandan. Now, this part of the river was pretty well explored by French settlers and explorers and hunters and trappers. But this was a place where a lot of people came for trade, and this is where they set up their next winter camp. So the winter of 1804, 1805, they spend with the Mandan Indians here. Now, this shows they carried presents to give to the Indian tribes, and so they would always give the chief an American flag. They talked about carrots of tobacco. I had to look that up, but you see how this looks like a carrot. So the tobacco was packaged in carrots or twists, a twist of tobacco. Of course, the Indians loved that. They had peace medals that had Jefferson on one side, and it says peace and friendship on the other with two hands shaking on the other side. Over here were these beads called wampum beads. The Indians loved the wampum beads. That was one of their favorite items. They had a few steel grain mills for grinding corn and stuff.
Do you need the wampum beads?
No. Those are for necklaces and decorating your body and stuff. And then they call them sunglasses. They were magnifying glasses for starting fires there. And then this is at that museum in Illinois. So again, you got the wampum beads, and they said blue. They ran out of blue first because blue was the most famous. Here's the medals, the American flags that were transported on the boat here. I've never been here yet, but this is Floyd's grave in Sioux City, Iowa. So I hope to get up there sometime soon. They also were amazed at how tight the meanders are on the river. This is what's called the Great Bend or the Grand Detour. And by boat around it is almost 30 miles. And across this isthmus, it's only 1.25 miles. So they were amazed at that tight meander there.
This is the Missouri.
That's the Missouri. Yeah, that's the Missouri. That Great Bend is up here in like South Dakota. Okay. And then so this is what the Mandan villages, they didn't live in teepees. They lived in these mud dome huts because it was very cold. Temperatures got down to like minus 45 degrees that winter. But the Mandans, these apparently provided great protection from the cold for them. And then Lewis and Clark built a triangular shaped fort called Fort Mandan, and they spent the winter with them. They encounter a young girl named Sacagawea, and I had never really studied her story, and now I'm a huge fan. She's just so impressive. If you don't know her story, so while they're at the Mandan villages, a French trader comes in. His name is Toussaint Charbonneau. They decide to hire him as an interpreter because he knows the Indian Sign Language and French and everything. And he has 2 Indian wives, and one of them is Sacagawea. Now, he's in his 40s, and she's about 15 or 16 years old, and she's pregnant. And Lewis actually delivers her baby there that spring. And so you see on the quarter there that she's shown with her little papoose. And her and the baby go the entire way across the Rocky Mountains. Imagine 2,000 miles across the mountains in the wintertime in canoes, and you're doing it with a newborn baby.
So they still have rivers to go on all the way up there, Roger?
Yeah, well, I'm going to show you here.
I'm sorry.
And that they did have to cross the Rockies with horses and that. So she was a Shoshone Indian. She was kidnapped by Hidatsu Indians, and then Charbonneau buys her from the Hidatsas and then makes her his wife, and then she's pregnant here, okay? And delivers, the baby's name is John Baptiste Charbonneau, and I'll talk about him a little bit here. Now, when you look at the Lewis and Clark Trail here, you say, what is all of this? Now, this is on the return voyage, so I'll come back to that, but at this time, they're just following the Missouri River. Now, when they leave the Mandan villages, they're basically going into unknown territory now. hardly any white men had ever been here. And when they get down here, they're basically the first white men to see southwestern Montana. But they come down, they encounter what's called the Great Falls. This is another fall. They had to portage around. It took them a month to portage around these 5 waterfalls. Then they come to the headwaters of Missouri, where there's 3 rivers, and they named them Jefferson after Thomas Jefferson, Madison after James Madison, who at the time was Secretary of State, and Robert Gallatin was Secretary of Treasury. So those 3 rivers were named here. Now, they know that the Shoshone Indians live here and that they're going to have horses, because the Indians in this part of the country, they got horses from the Spanish who were already in California and stuff, and there was trade and so forth. And since Sacagawea is a Shoshone, they're like, she'll be able to help interpret for us and help acquire these horses. And if you think, if you ever heard the term small world, when they meet the Shoshones, the chief is her brother. And here they are being reunited after she was kidnapped as a young girl. It's a beautiful story, actually. Talks about everybody's crying because she has been reunited with her brother. And they do get horses from the Shoshones. And so now they cache, they dig caches and bury some supplies. They cache their boats and stuff. Also, I forgot to mention that the big boat was sent back from the Mandan villages. It was too big to come any further. And there was a small group, I think it was about 8 to 10 men that brought it back down to St. Louis. And what they had collected at that point was shipped all the way back to Washington, D.C. So Jefferson got stuff before the expedition was even over here. Okay, then they crossed the mountains on horseback. They ended up acquiring approximately 40 horses, and they didn't really know where they were going, and even their Shoshone guide was not real familiar. So you can see they kind of wander around a little bit here. But they eventually get to what's a famous pass called the Lolo Pass, where they're able to pass through the mountains and get across the Continental Divide, and then they're going to get to the Columbia River eventually, and then take the Columbia to the west coast. But again, they didn't know how far that was, and it was much further and a lot harder work than they were hoping. And of course, the main purpose of all this is the most valuable resource is beaver, because beaver hats were very popular in Europe. This is a picture I took of a beaver dam in Montana about 4 years ago. Beautiful beaver dam, but beaver were very thick in this area. Now here we are, the West Coast. So they come down what's called the Clearwater River to the Snake River to the Columbia, and then out to the West Coast. Now, one story is they had some pretty big rapids, but it's downstream. So, the story is that the Indians would come and line up on the stream to watch these idiots riding these canoes down these rapids, and they were laughing at them and say, we come to watch you kill yourselves. And that, so they had some pretty harrowing rapids to ride.
Pretty sturdy boats, because the rapids can really do a number on them.
Well, these were dugout canoes, so they were tree logs. So yeah, they were pretty sturdy. Then they get to the West Coast and have to figure out where to camp, because they have another winter camp. This is their 3rd winter camp. And they wanted to camp up here, but the Clatsop Indians tell them that if you camp in Oregon here, there's going to be more elk. You'll have more food for the winter. So they camp at what's called Fort Clatsop. It's close to Astoria, Oregon here. They also set up this salt works where they boiled salt, seawater to make salt to preserve their meat there. And then when the winter's over, then they follow their tracks pretty much back up across here. And I would say of the 50 Indian tribes, the one that they met the most here in kind of western Idaho and eastern Oregon was the Nez Perce. They developed such a close friendship with the Nez Perce. It's really touching. It said that they would have like Olympic games, they'd have foot races and horse races. And and then the Nez Perce actually helped them get back across the Rockies here. And there's a place where they come to these hot springs, and the Indians they're doing like little kids. They go into hot springs and they get really hot, and then they jump in the cold river, and then they jump back in the hot spring. And so these Indians were doing that. They also encountered the famous Flathead Indians, where they would put their baby on a board and make the head become deformed here. So that's western Idaho, eastern Washington, Oregon, where they do that.
Does that look flatten the head?
Yeah, that's how they flatten the head with that baby board there. And then this is a picture of Fort Clatsop that they built there for that winter. You can see that they put up an American flag. Now, if you're a conspiracy theorist, always notice that the Louisiana Territory doesn't go there. They were not where they were supposed to be, real technically. But Thomas Jefferson, his vision is that we would eventually all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And something that's even more valuable than a beaver is an otter. And on the West Coast, we could establish trade relations to trade otter skins with the Chinese. That's what the ultimate goal is here. But this is unclaimed territory. The Russians wanted it. The Russians had Alaska, so they want it. The Spanish want it. The British wanted it. So, but Thomas Jefferson says, I'm putting an American flag on this. And we did eventually get it, of course. Real quick here on this way back. Now, the reason this is so strange looking is on the way back, they had to do a little extra exploring, and they divided up into two groups. Lewis leads a group up here, up this Marias River. It's a tributary, because Bonaparte said, when you get the Louisiana Purchase, what you're getting is the Missouri River and its tributaries. And so Jefferson says, I hope that the tributaries go all the way up to like the 51st or 52nd parallel. Well, Lewis goes up here and finds out that they only went up to the 49th parallel. And today our northern border with Canada is the 49th parallel because of that. But Lewis makes that latitude and you see it's called Camp Disappointment because it wasn't as high as they were hoping it would be. Now Clark and Sacagawea come back down the way they came to dig up their caches and get their stuff. Now you'll notice here that they decided it might actually be shorter to use the Yellowstone River than the Missouri. And so Sacagawea knows this territory, so she leads them across to the Yellowstone River, and they make some dugout canoes, and Clark and Sacagawea come down here, and it flows into the Missouri, basically where North Dakota and Montana meet right here. And then Clark and Lewis meet back up right here on the way back. And really touching story is Clark and Sacagawea become very close friends. I think he kind of looked at her as like a adopted daughter, and he protects her. She had obvious venereal disease, and he's like, I blame her husband because he had multiple Indian wives. And then there's one time where he hits her, and Clark reprimands him. So he protects her, and in the journals, he's like, this woman is so useful to me. She's gathering roots and herbs. She's from suffering scurvy because of the vegetation that she put in her diet there. So major contributions that she did. Pretty amazing woman here. Then they get back to the Mandans, and they leave Sacagawea and her husband here. And Clark says, if you'd like, I'd take the baby and raise it as my own child. And she says, well, he hasn't been weaned yet. But like another year later, after she weans the baby, she actually sends him to St. Louis, and he raises him as his own child. And he actually goes to Europe and gets educated in Europe. So pretty amazing story there as well. Okay, so as I'm running out of time, back to this map. Now they have to come down to Missouri back to St. Louis, which is downstream. So it's much easier. Now, on the way up from St. Louis to Mandan, it took them 5.5 months going upstream. It only took them 6 weeks coming back. And they get back to St. Louis. And so I just took this picture last week. This is right outside the St. Louis Arch. And so here's them celebrating landing on shore at St. Louis. So you got Lewis and Clark and Seaman here. And there's these statues all along the Lewis and Clark Trail. So I'm trying to hit all of those. And then what I thought was a neat story, this is the map that Clark makes of the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis takes it back to Washington, D.C., and it says him and Thomas Jefferson, if you can imagine, they're like two little boys in the Oval Office in the White House. They get down on their hands and knees, and they're just looking at this map like a couple of little boys there. And I love that story too. So that's pretty cool. And then I've been to their graves. Clark is buried in St. Louis, and Meriwether Lewis is buried not too far from here on the Natchez Trace in Hohenwald, Tennessee. And unfortunately, he committed suicide. But his grave is down there. Okay. And so that's going to be my stopping point. Any questions? So
One of the interesting things is when they got back, nobody was expecting, they all thought they'd died because
Yeah.
they'd been gone so long.
they didn't want to do that extra winter in Washington. They were hoping to get there and come back, but they got stuck another winter. And so, yeah, everybody had given them up for dead, thought they were, because they were gone so long. But it ended up being, from St. Louis and back was 2 years and 4 months there that it took. And then plus the previous about 7 or 8 months coming down from Pittsburgh. So it's a long expedition. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys. I hope you learned something, hopefully.
Good stuff. Don't forget.